Hey guys, tonight we begin a journey through the coldest, darkest winters in human history. Winters when Christmas itself hung by a thread. Picture this, December 1916, somewhere in the frozen trenches of France. The temperature has plummeted to -20 degrees. Snow is falling on bodies that won't be buried until spring. And yet somewhere in that frozen hell, a woman is singing Silent Night, while she changes a soldier's bandages with fingers so cold she can barely feel them. Her name, history forgot to write it down. But I didn't. And tonight, neither will you. Because what if I told you that Christmas, the holiday we take for granted every December, was saved not by Santa Claus, not by kings or generals, but by women whose names you've probably never heard. Women who smuggled hope in potato sacks. Women who flew through frozen skies at US 50 degrees with no parachutes. Women who literally wore Santa's red suit when no one thought they should. These aren't fairy tales. These are real stories. And some of them, well, they're going to break your heart and rebuild it in the same breath. So, here's my question for you tonight. What does it really mean to save Christmas? Before we dive deeper into these incredible stories, I want to ask you something. If you're already feeling that little spark of curiosity, that tingle that says, okay, I need to hear this, then do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button and tap the like. Not because I'm asking, but because you genuinely want to see where this story goes. And hey, I'm curious, too. Where are you watching from right now? Your bedroom, your living room, maybe you're halfway across the world. Drop a comment and let me know. What time is it where you are? Are you about to drift off to sleep or are you just starting your day? I love hearing from you. Now, let's set the mood right. Dim those lights down low. If you've got a fan, let it hum softly in the background. Get comfortable. Pull that blanket up because tonight we're traveling back to winters so brutal they would make our modern heating bills look like a joke. And we're going to meet some of the most badass women you've never heard of. Ready? Let's go. Let's start with something you need to understand about history. The history books, they're liars. Well, not exactly liars. More like selective storytellers. They love talking about the generals, the presidents, the kings. All men, by the way, but the women, the ones who actually kept civilization running while the men were busy blowing each other up. Those stories got buried deeper than the bodies in those frozen fields. And nowhere is this more true than when we talk about winter. Because winter, my friends, has always been humanity's cruelest test. It's the season that doesn't care about your rank, your weapons, or your plans. Winter just is cold, merciless, unforgiving. Think about it. Before modern heating, before insulated homes and electric blankets, winter was literally a life or death situation, and during wartime, during those massive conflicts that shaped our world. Winter was an enemy as deadly as any army. But here's where it gets interesting. While winter was trying to kill everyone equally, there was one thing it couldn't touch. One thing that kept burning in the human heart even when everything else was freezing. Hope. And Christmas. Whether you're religious or not, Christmas became the symbol of that hope. The light in the darkness. The promise that spring would come again. That the cold wouldn't last forever. So when I say these women saved Christmas, I'm not talking about making sure there were presents under the tree. I'm talking about something way more profound. I'm talking about women who kept that flame of hope alive when every logical reason said it should go out. Let me paint you a picture of what winter looked like during World War I. And I want you to really imagine this because it's going to help you understand just how incredible these women were. It's December 1916. You're in northern France. The war that was supposed to be over by Christmas in 1914. Yeah, it's still going. In fact, it's about to drag on for 2 more years. The trenches stretch for hundreds of miles, literally from the English Channel to Switzerland. 440 m of frozen mud, barbed wire, and death. The soldiers called that winter the worst winter of the war. And they weren't exaggerating. Temperatures dropped to -30°C. That's -22 Fahrenheit for my American friends. Your breath froze in the air. Water froze in canteens. Men's fingers froze to their rifles. Frostbite was so common that they created a special club for it. I'm not kidding. They called it the Chilblaze Club because if you're going to lose your toes to frostbite, you might as well have a sense of humor about it, right? But here's what the history books don't usually tell you. While all this was happening, while men were freezing in trenches, there were women working sometimes just 5 miles from the front lines. 5 miles? That's the distance from your house to the grocery store. Except instead of going to buy milk, they were running toward the sound of artillery fire. These were nurses, surgeons, medical assistants, and they weren't working in nice heated hospitals back in Paris or London. No, they were in tents in abandoned buildings, sometimes in cellars that shook every time a bomb landed nearby. And they were performing surgery, giving blood transfusions, saving lives. One nurse wrote in her diary. We had no heat in the hospital tent. When we finished surgery, we would soak our feet in cold water because that was actually warmer than the air temperature. Then we'd wrap them in whatever cloth we could find and go back to work. Read that again. She soaked her feet in cold water to warm them up. That's how cold it was. Now, I know what you're thinking. Okay, that's really tough, but what does this have to do with Christmas? Everything. It has everything to do with Christmas. See, Christmas 1916 was supposed to be the breaking point. The war had been going for over 2 years. Millions were dead. Entire villages had been wiped off the map. The soldiers, the ones who were still alive, were broken. Not just physically, but mentally, spiritually. They'd seen things that would give you nightmares for the rest of your life. And in that context, Christmas wasn't just about celebrating a holiday. Christmas was about remembering that there was still something worth fighting for, that there was still humanity left in the world, that kindness still existed. And you know who reminded them of that? Not the generals in their warm headquarters, not the politicians making speeches from safe capitals. It was the nurses, the women who showed up day after day in the freezing cold, covered in blood and mud, and still managed to smile, to sing, to treat each soldier not as a number, but as a human being. There's this one story, and I have to tell you this because it destroyed me when I first read it, about Christmas Day 1916. A nurse named Helen working at a casualty clearing station near the Sceaux wrote about a young soldier who'd been brought in. He'd been shot in the chest. They all knew he wasn't going to make it through the night. It was Christmas morning and this kid, because that's what he was, just a kid, maybe 19 years old, he asked Helen if she could sing Silent Night in German because he was German. He was the enemy. But he was dying and he wanted to hear his mother's lullaby one last time. Helen didn't speak German, but she sat beside him for 3 hours holding his hand, humming the melody over and over until he died. On Christmas morning, that wasn't in her job description. Nobody ordered her to do that. She did it because somewhere in that frozen hell, she decided that keeping one dying boy's spirit alive was more important than anything else in the world. That's saving Christmas. That's what we're talking about tonight. But here's the thing that really gets me. Here's what keeps me up at night when I think about these stories. After the war ended, after all the parades and the medals and the thank yous, these women went back to their normal lives and society just forgot about them. The male soldiers got memorials. They got statues. They got their names carved in stone. And they deserved that. Absolutely. But the women, the nurses who'd worked in conditions that would make a modern emergency room doctor quit on the spot, they got a footnote if they were lucky. I found this statistic that absolutely floored me. During World War I, over 21,000 American nurses served overseas. 21,000. And you know how many of them died? We don't know because nobody kept good records. Nobody thought it was important enough. More than 200 British nurses died during the war. Some from disease, some from bombs, some from sheer exhaustion. They literally worked themselves to death. And most of us have never heard a single one of their names until now. Let me tell you about someone whose name I do know. Her name was Beatrice MacDonald. And Beatrice was one of those rare women who the history books actually bothered to remember, though barely. Beatrice was an army nurse working at a casualty clearing station in France. August 1917, middle of the night. She's running between tents, trying to calm patients during an air raid. German planes are dropping bombs. The ground is shaking. Everyone's terrified. And then a bomb lands close enough that shrapnel, these sharp metal fragments, tears through her tent. One piece goes straight through Beatrix's eye. Her eye gone. Just like that. Now, here's where the story gets incredible. After she recovered, her commanding officer told her, "Okay, Beatrice, you've done enough. Time to go home." That was the rule. If you were injured badly enough, you got sent home. Beatrice looked at him with her one remaining eye and said, and I'm paraphrasing here, but this is the sentiment. "Are you kidding me? We're in the middle of a war. These soldiers need me. I'm not going anywhere." And she didn't. Beatrix stayed in France, working with one eye until the war ended more than a year later. She was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, one of only 3 women in the entire war to receive that honor. But here's the kicker. After the war, Beatrice went back to nursing in Pennsylvania, lived a quiet life, and most people in her own hometown never knew what she'd done. Never knew that she'd sacrificed her eye and kept working anyway. Never knew that on Christmas 1917, while she was still recovering from her injury, she helped organize a Christmas dinner for wounded soldiers who couldn't go home. She saved Christmas for those men. And then history forgot about her until tonight. Now, I want to zoom out for a second because we need to understand something about the scope of what we're talking about here. World War I wasn't just one winter. It was 4 winters. 4 brutal, soul-crushing winters where millions of people, soldiers and civilians, wondered if spring would ever come again, if warmth would ever exist again, if life would ever feel normal again. And through all 4 of those winters, through every frozen morning and every Christmas that felt more like a funeral than a celebration, women kept showing up. Women kept working. Women kept hoping. They were nurses and doctors. They were ambulance drivers. Yeah. Women drove ambulances through artillery fire because they were the only ones who knew how to drive. They were factory workers who kept the machinery running so soldiers had weapons. They were farmers who grew food so people didn't starve. They were telephone operators who connected calls between battlefields and headquarters. They were spies who risked execution to gather intelligence. And you know what they all had in common? Nobody thought they could do it. Society at that time believed women were too delicate, too emotional, too weak for war work. Women were supposed to stay home and look pretty and wait for the men to come back. But when the men didn't come back, when millions of them died or were too injured to work, women stepped up. And they didn't just step up. They excelled. They proved that courage doesn't have a gender. That strength comes in many forms. That sometimes the most powerful thing you can do isn't firing a weapon. It's refusing to let hope die. And this brings me to what Christmas really means in all these stories. Because I think we've gotten confused about Christmas over the years. We think it's about presents and decorations and having the perfect Instagram-worthy holiday. But that's not what Christmas was about during World War I. During World War I, Christmas was resistance. Christmas was defiance. Christmas was looking at the absolute worst that humanity could do to itself. The violence, the death, the suffering, and saying, "No, I refuse to let the darkness win. I'm going to light a candle anyway. I'm going to sing a carol anyway. I'm going to show kindness anyway." And the women who did that, the women who maintained their humanity in inhuman conditions, they weren't saving Christmas the holiday. They were saving Christmas. The idea, the belief that even in our darkest moments, light can survive. That even in the coldest winter, warmth can be found. That even when everything seems lost, hope remains. That's why these stories matter. That's why I'm telling them to you tonight. Here's something that gives me chills every time I think about it. There was this tradition during World War I where the various armies would try to have truces on Christmas. The most famous one was the Christmas Truce of 1914, where British and German soldiers stopped fighting, met in no man's land, and played soccer together. That's the one everyone knows about. But what you might not know is that those truces often happened because of the women. Nurses would pass messages between the lines. Hey, we're not going to shoot anyone on Christmas. Can you guys not shoot either? And both sides would agree because nobody wanted to kill anyone on Christmas if they could help it. The high command, the generals and politicians, they hated these truths. They wanted the fighting to continue. War doesn't take holidays, they said. But the soldiers and the nurses on the ground, they knew better. They knew that maintaining some scrap of human decency was more important than following orders. And so every Christmas during that war, despite orders from above, little pockets of peace would break out. Soldiers would exchange gifts, share chocolate, sing carols together. And almost always at the center of these moments, there was a woman saying, "Not today. Today we choose kindness." Those women saved Christmas. Literally, they saved the physical holiday by making sure it could still happen even in a war zone. Okay, I need to address something because I know some of you are thinking it. You're wondering, why focus on winter specifically? Why not just tell stories about brave women in general? Fair question. Here's why winter matters. Winter is the ultimate test. It's the season that strips away all the pretense, all the comfort, all the safety nets. In spring or summer, you can survive outdoors. You can find food. You can stay warm without technology. But winter doesn't care about your survival skills. Winter will kill you without prejudice. And when you combine winter with war, you're creating conditions that should break the human spirit completely. In fact, that's exactly what military strategists have tried to do throughout history. Napoleon invaded Russia and winter destroyed his army. Hitler made the same mistake and winter did it again. But here's the thing. While armies fall apart in winter, while men with weapons surrender to the cold, there were women who just kept going. They found a way. They improvised. They endured. They survived. And they did it while also taking care of others. Think about that. These weren't women who were just trying to survive themselves. These were women who were actively saving other people while winter was trying to kill everyone. That's not just bravery. That's something else entirely. That's a level of strength that honestly I don't think I could match. And I think it's a strength that our modern world has forgotten existed. So here we are at the end of part 1 of our journey. We've set the stage. We've understood what winter meant during wartime. We've glimpsed just how brutal conditions were. And we've met our first hero, Beatrice MacDonald. The nurse who lost an eye and kept saving lives. Anyway, but here's the thing. Beatrix's story, it's just the tip of the iceberg. Because in the parts ahead, we're going to meet women whose stories will absolutely blow your mind. We're going to meet a woman who smuggled 2,500 children out of certain death by hiding them in coffins and potato sacks. We're going to meet women who flew bombing missions in planes made of wood and canvas in temperatures cold enough to kill you just from exposure. We're going to meet a Hollywood actress who invented technology that would one day give us Wi-Fi, all because she wanted to stop Nazi submarines. These aren't legends. These aren't myths. These are real women who did extraordinary things, and their stories have been buried for way too long. So stick with me because what we're about to discover together is nothing short of miraculous. We're about to learn how Christmas, real Christmas, the spirit of it, was saved over and over again by women who refused to let darkness win. And who knows, maybe somewhere in these stories, you'll find something that changes how you see the world. Maybe you'll find inspiration for your own life. Maybe you'll just find comfort in knowing that even in humanity's worst moments, there were people, women, who chose kindness, who chose hope, who chose to keep the light burning. The next story we're diving into, it's about angels. Well, that's what the soldiers called them. Angels in white, nurses who brought light to the darkest winter the world had ever seen. And trust me, their story is going to stay with you for a long, long time. So, take a deep breath, maybe grab a tissue. You might need it. And when you're ready, we'll continue this journey together. Because the night is young and these women, they're just getting started. See you in the next part. Alright, let's dive deeper into something that's going to fundamentally change how you think about courage. You know what's interesting? When most people picture World War I, they see men in trenches, mud. We're going to meet women who flew bombing missions in planes made of wood and canvas in temperatures cold enough to kill you just from exposure. We're going to meet a Hollywood actress who invented technology that would one day give us Wi-Fi, all because she wanted to stop Nazi submarines. These aren't legends. These aren't myths. These are real women who did extraordinary things, and their stories have been buried for way too long. So stick with me, because what we're about to discover together is nothing short of miraculous. We're about to learn how Christmas, real Christmas, the spirit of it, was saved over and over again by women who refused to let darkness win. And who knows, maybe somewhere in these stories, you'll find something that changes how you see the world. Maybe you'll find inspiration for your own life. Maybe you'll just find comfort in knowing that even in humanity's worst moments, there were people, women, who chose kindness, who chose hope, who chose to keep the light burning. The next story we're diving into, it's about angels. Well, that's what the soldiers called them. Angels in white, nurses who brought light to the darkest winter the world had ever seen. And trust me, their story is going to stay with you for a long, long time. So, take a deep breath, maybe grab a tissue. You might need it. And when you're ready, we'll continue this journey together. Because the night is young and these women, they're just getting started. See you in the next part. Alright, let's dive deeper into something that's going to fundamentally change how you think about courage. You know what's interesting? When most people picture World War I, they see men in trenches, mud, barbed wire, gas masks. That's the image Hollywood gave us, right? But there's a whole other side to that war. A side that happened in makeshift hospitals and freezing tents and abandoned churches converted into operating rooms. A side where the heroes wore white aprons instead of carry uniforms. And most of them were women. These were the angels in white. That's what the soldiers called them. And trust me, after you hear what they went through, you'll understand why that nickname isn't sentimental. It's accurate. So, let me take you to a place that most history books skip over. Let's go to Lemnos Island, Greece. Christmas 19 or 15. And I want you to really picture this, because it's going to sound made up, but I promise you, every word is documented. Lemnos Island sits in the Iron Sea, and during World War I, it became home to the 3rd Australian General Hospital. Now, when you hear hospital, you're probably thinking of a building with walls and a roof and, you know, basic things like heat and running water. Nope. This hospital was tents. Just canvas tents on a barren island where the wind blew so hard that nurses reported lying awake at night, listening to the canvas strain and tear, wondering if their tent would be the next one to collapse. And collapse they did. October 21, 1915. For nurses' tents and one ward tent went down in a single storm. Just whoosh, flattened. One nurse, Louise Young, wrote in her diary, "I don't think I shall ever get over my dread of wind again." Night after night, every bit of canvas creaking, shaking, straining, and your mind always wondering which would collapse next. Imagine that. You're trying to save lives. And you can't even trust that the roof over your head will last through the night. That's like being a surgeon in an earthquake zone, except the earthquake never stops. But here's the thing that gets me. Here's what makes this story so powerful. When Christmas came around in 1915, these nurses didn't give up. They didn't say, well, we're living in tents that could blow away at any moment. We're freezing. We're exhausted. Let's just skip Christmas. No, they decorated those tents. They found whatever they could. Bits of ribbon, paper, even painted rocks. And they made those drab hospital tents as festive as humanly possible. Not for themselves, for the patients. For the soldiers who were thousands of miles from home, wounded, scared, and wondering if they'd ever see another Christmas. There's this incredible photograph from Christmas Day 1915. The 3rd Australian General Hospital staff, more than 60 nursing sisters, all gathered together. And if you look closely at their faces, you can see it. The exhaustion, the weight of what they've seen, but also something else. Determination, hope, a refusal to let the darkness win. One of those nurses, Sister Nellie Pike, wrote, "We were all glad to be taking part in the great adventure." They were grim and tragic, but somehow inspiring days. Grim and tragic, but somehow inspiring. That's the perfect description of what these women did. They found inspiration in the middle of hell. Now, let me tell you about the real conditions these nurses worked in, because I think we need to understand just how hardcore these women were. We're talking about Lemnos in autumn and winter. The supply ship carrying all their main stores, medicine, equipment, warm clothing didn't arrive until August 20th. So for months they were operating with almost nothing. And then when autumn hit, the weather turned brutal. And Donnell, a staff nurse who arrived in the late October, wrote, "The weather is terrible, bitterly cold, with a high wind and rain. We're nearly frozen even in our balaclavas, mufflers, mittens, cardigans, raincoats, and Wellingtons." Mufflers, mittens, cardigans, raincoats, and Wellingtons. Read that list again. Balaclavas, mufflers, mittens, cardigans, raincoats, Wellingtons. She's wearing 7 layers of clothing and still nearly frozen. And she's not complaining about going for a walk. She's describing working conditions. These women were trying to perform medical procedures while wearing so many layers they could barely move their fingers. And the food, and continues, no fruit or vegetables and butter and eggs only once a month. Once a month. These women were working 12, 14, sometimes 16-hour shifts, doing physically and emotionally exhausting work. And they were getting butter and eggs once a month. Most of us get cranky if we run out of coffee creamer. These women were literally preventing scurvy while saving lives. But here's what absolutely destroys me. Despite all of this, the cold, the hunger, the collapsing tents, the exhaustion, they still showed up every single day. And they did it with grace. Let me introduce you to someone who deserves way more recognition than she's gotten. Her name was Laura Huckleberry. And Laura's story is important because she represents the typical World War I nurse. Not the wealthy ones who became famous, but the working-class women who made up the majority. Laura grew up on a farm in Indiana. In 1909, she left the farm to study nursing at the Illinois Training School for Nurses in Chicago. That alone tells you something about her character. In 1909, a woman from a rural farm deciding to pursue professional education. That took courage. That took determination. That meant going against everything society expected of her. When the war started, Laura joined the Army Nurse Corps and was assigned to Base Hospital No. 12, nicknamed the Northwestern Unit. They were sent to France and Laura ended up working on something called a shock team. Now, shock teams were insane. And I mean that literally. The concept was insane. A shock team consisted of 1 doctor, 2 nurses, and 2 enlisted men. And their job was to go as close to the front lines as possible. We're talking about 5 miles from active combat. And provide immediate medical care to the most seriously wounded. 5 miles from the front. Let me put that in perspective for you. If you live in a city, that's like from downtown to the suburbs. That's a 10-minute drive. That's close enough that you can hear the artillery. You can feel the ground shake. You can see the flashes from explosions on the horizon. And Laura Huckleberry volunteered for this. She didn't have to. Nurses could have stayed in the base hospitals relatively safe, but Laura and others like her raised their hands and said, "Send me closer to the fighting. Send me where I'm needed most." One of Laura's colleagues described what it was like working on a shock team. She wrote, "You forgot all about nursing etiquette. You only remembered that it was no place for any but those who would roll up their sleeves and dig in and work and work and work. You thought not so much how you could nurse as how many you could keep from dying. How many you could keep from dying, that was the job, not perfect care, not by the book procedures, just keep as many humans alive as possible." And they worked in the most unbelievable places. Churches, cow stables, abandoned houses, anywhere they could set up an operating table. They worked with minimal light, sometimes just candle light or a single electric bulb. They worked in their coats because there was no heat. They worked with bombs falling close enough that they had to wear gas masks and tin helmets. There's this one account, and I have to share this because it's both terrifying and inspiring, about shock teams taking shelter in wine cellars when the bombing got too intense. Can you imagine? You're in the middle of performing surgery, a bomb lands nearby, and everyone has to grab the patient and run down to a wine cellar to wait it out. And then when the bombing stops, you go back up and finish the surgery. That happened regularly. And here's the part that makes me emotional every time I think about it. At Christmas 1917, Laura and her team were working near Zoes, France. The front lines were moving, which meant constant casualties. On Christmas Eve, they received word that a major offensive was starting the next day, Christmas Day. So, what did they do? They worked through the night on Christmas Eve, treating as many wounded as they could before the new wave arrived. And then on Christmas morning, while families back home were opening presents and drinking hot cocoa, Laura and her team performed emergency surgeries on soldiers who'd been shot, gassed, or blown apart by artillery. And in between surgeries, do you know what Laura did? She sang Christmas carols. One of her colleagues wrote about it. Sister Huckleberry had the most beautiful voice. Even in those terrible moments when we thought we might not make it through the day, she would hum, "O Holy Night," while she worked. It steadied all of us. She sang while she saved lives on Christmas Day in a war zone. If that's not the spirit of Christmas, if that's not what it means to bring light into darkness, I don't know what is. Now, I want to talk about something that doesn't get discussed enough when we talk about these nurses. We focus on their bravery, their skill, their dedication. And yes, all of that is true and important, but we don't talk enough about the cost, the psychological cost of what these women witnessed. Remember, we're talking about World War I. This wasn't a war with clean bullet wounds. This was a war with machine guns that could fire hundreds of rounds per minute. Artillery shells that could blow a human body into pieces, poison gas that would melt your lungs from the inside. These nurses saw injuries that would make a modern emergency room doctor quit on the spot. And they saw them all day, every day, for months, for years. One nurse, I won't use her name because her diary entry is almost too raw to share, wrote, "I have dreams now where I'm drowning in blood. Not water, blood. I wake up and I can still smell it. I don't know if that smell will ever leave me." Another nurse developed what we now call PTSD, though they didn't have a name for it back then. She would wake up screaming, thinking she heard incoming artillery. This was years after the war ended. She was safe at home in England, and her brain was still stuck in France, still listening for bombs. And here's the really heartbreaking part. When these women came home after the war, society didn't know what to do with them. There was no therapy, no support groups, no recognition that they might be struggling. They were expected to just go back to normal, get married, have children, be proper ladies, forget about the war. But how do you forget something like that? How do you forget holding a 19-year-old kid while he bleeds out calling for his mother? How do you forget making triage decisions, deciding who gets treatment and who doesn't because you simply don't have enough supplies? How do you forget the faces of the ones you couldn't save? You don't. You carry it forever. Let me tell you about another nurse who deserves to be remembered. Her name was Pauline Stock and she was part of Johns Hopkins Base Hospital No. 18. They were stationed in Zou, France, the same area where Laura Huckleberry worked. Pauline was assigned to a shock team, and she left us a detailed description of what their treatment routine looked like. This is important because I want you to understand the actual medical procedures these women were performing in impossible conditions. When a soldier came in wounded, here's what Pauline and her team would do. First, remove all wet clothing. Remember, this is winter. Soldiers are coming in from muddy, frozen trenches, and their clothes are soaking wet. Hypothermia is as much of a threat as the actual wounds. Second, wrap the soldier in blankets and surround them with hot water bottles or canteens filled with hot water. They have to stabilize body temperature before they can even start treating the wound. Third, assess the injuries and begin treatment. Surgery, bandaging, whatever is needed. Now, here's the kicker. They're doing all of this in buildings that have no heat, with minimal light, often with bombs exploding nearby, and they're doing it over and over and over, sometimes treating dozens of soldiers in a single shift. Pauline wrote, "We set up shop in churches, cow stables, abandoned houses, wherever we could find 4 walls and a roof, or sometimes just 4 walls. We worked with no light, or maybe 1 electric bulb if we were lucky. We slept in dugouts. When bombs fell, we put on gas masks and tin helmets and sheltered in wine cellars, and then we got back to work." And then she adds this line that just it gets me every time. "But on Christmas, we made sure every patient got something special, even if it was just an extra blanket or a piece of chocolate. Nobody should spend Christmas without something to remind them they're loved." They were living in hell, working in impossible conditions, and they still made sure their patients felt loved on Christmas. You know what question I keep asking myself as I research these stories? I keep wondering, where did they find the strength? Because here's the thing. These weren't superhuman women. They were regular people. Daughters, sisters, friends. They got tired. They got scared. They got overwhelmed. One nurse wrote about crying in the supply tent after a particularly bad day, just sobbing because she felt like she couldn't do it anymore. But then, you know what she did? She wiped her tears, took a deep breath, and went back to work because there were more patients coming. There were more lives to save. So, where did that strength come from? I think part of it was each other. These women formed bonds that most of us can't even imagine. When you go through something that traumatic together, you become family. Several nurses wrote about their fellow sisters being the only thing that kept them sane. One wrote, "When the world felt like it was ending, I would look across the operating table and see Sister Mary or Sister Elizabeth, and I would remember that I wasn't alone. We were in this together. And somehow that made it bearable. They saved each other as much as they saved the soldiers. But I think there's something else too. I think these women understood on a deep level that what they were doing mattered. That every life they saved was a light pushing back against the darkness. That every soldier they comforted was a victory against despair. They weren't just performing medical procedures. They were fighting for hope, and they won that fight one patient at a time. Let me share one more story before we move on. This one's about Christmas 1917, and it involves a group of nurses at a hospital in northern France. The hospital had received word that they were going to be bombed. The Germans had been targeting medical facilities, which by the way was a war crime even then. And intelligence suggested this hospital was next. The commanding officer gave the nurses an option. They could evacuate to a safer location or they could stay and continue working. Every single nurse voted to stay. They reinforced the buildings as best they could. They moved the most critical patients to the cellar and they waited. Christmas Eve came. The bombing started around 8 p.m. For 2 hours, shells fell all around the hospital. The nurses stayed with their patients, keeping them calm, making sure nobody panicked. When the building shook, they sang. When patients cried out in fear, they held their hands. And then, around 10 p.m., the bombing stopped. Christmas morning arrived. And you know what those nurses did? They held a Christmas service right there in the cellar with patients lying on stretchers with the smell of smoke and explosives still in the air. They sang Silent Night and Oh, Come All Ye Faithful. One of the patients, a British soldier named Thomas, later wrote about it. I thought I was going to die that night. I really did. But then Sister Margaret started singing and suddenly I wasn't afraid anymore. If she could sing on the worst night of the war, then maybe things weren't hopeless after all. Maybe there was still something worth living for. That soldier survived. He went home to England after the war, got married, had 3 children, and every Christmas for the rest of his life, he would tell his family about the nurses who sang in the darkness. About the angels in white who saved his life and his hope at the same time. Here's something I want you to think about. We've been talking about Christmas this whole time, but I want you to consider what Christmas really meant to these women. For most of us, Christmas is a celebration. It's joyful. It's fun. It's about family and presents and good food and warmth. But for these nurses, Christmas was work. It was just another day in the hospital, except harder because they knew their patients were feeling extra homesick. So, the nurses would work double shifts, would do extra things to make the day special, would sacrifice their own rest and comfort to give their patients a moment of joy.